The bitter Wyoming wind howled like a banshee through the pines, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the desperate whimpers of someone dying in the snow. Elias Blackwood jolted awake in his cabin, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for the Colt 45 beneath his pillow. Through the frost-covered window, he saw her, a figure in torn silk and velvet, stumbling through the drifts like a ghost from his nightmares. When she collapsed at his doorstep, her raven black hair spilling across the white snow like spilled ink. He couldn't have known that this moment would force him to choose between the redemption he'd spent 5 years seeking and the woman who would awaken desires he thought were buried forever. But when those emerald eyes opened and looked into his, Elias Blackwood saw his own damnation staring back at him. Those were Fletcher eyes, the eyes of his greatest enemy. What do you do when saving an angel means embracing the devil? And where are you watching this story unfold from tonight? December winds in the Wyoming Territory don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't forget. Neither did Elias Blackwood, though God knew he'd tried for 5 long years. The cabin sat like a scar on the mountainside, 40 miles north of Laramie, where civilization ended and a man's past could finally leave him be. Or so he'd thought. She was barely breathing when he carried her inside, her skin pale as morning frost, lips blue with cold. The bullet wound in her shoulder had bled through her expensive riding dress, emerald silk that matched her eyes and probably cost more than most folks saw in a year. This wasn't some settler's daughter caught in a storm. Elias had pulled enough bullets from enough bodies to work with steady hands. Even when those hands belonged to a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Denver Society portrait, as he cut away the blood-soaked fabric, revealing smooth shoulders that had never known a day's hard labor. She stirred. "Please." Her voice was cultured, educated, with just a hint of desperation that made his chest tighten. "They're coming. They'll kill me if they find me here." "Who's coming?" Elias kept his voice gentle as he pressed clean cloth to her wound. Her eyes fluttered open, those devastating green eyes that would haunt him, and she whispered, I can't tell you. But please, if you have any mercy in your heart." She fainted again, leaving Elias with more questions than a man his age should have to carry. But as he bandaged her shoulder and covered her with his only good blanket, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had just walked through his door, wearing a silk dress and a smile that could start wars. When she woke 3 days later, she told him her name was Mary Walsh. It was a lie, of course. Everything about her was a lie, except the way she looked at him, like a woman seeing salvation in the most unlikely of places. "You saved my life," she said, sitting up carefully in his bed, the blanket slipping just enough to reveal the graceful curve of her collarbone. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Elias turned away from those grateful eyes, busying himself with coffee that didn't need making. No need for repaying. Just get well and move on. This ain't a place for ladies. But she did move on. Mary Walsh, whoever she really was, had hands that could turn his rough cabin into something approaching a home. She cooked meals that reminded him what food was supposed to taste like, mended his clothes with delicate fingers that fascinated him more than they should have, and in the evenings, she would read aloud from a book of poetry she'd somehow salvaged from whatever hell she'd escaped. "Listen to this, Mr. Blackwood," she said one night, her voice soft in the firelight. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep." "Robert Frost," Elias said quietly, not looking up from the saddle he was mending. She paused, surprised. "You know poetry?" "Used to. Before." He let the words hang there like smoke. "Before what?" That was when he should have told her to pack her things and ride on. Instead, he found himself talking about books, about the life he'd had before he became a hermit with blood on his hands and ghosts in his dreams. She listened with the kind of attention that made a man feel like his words mattered, like maybe he wasn't completely lost after all. It was dangerous, this feeling of being seen, more dangerous than any gunfight he'd ever walked into. "You're not like other men," she said softly, and the way her eyes lingered on his face made something long dormant stir in his chest. "That a good thing or a bad thing, Mary?" She smiled. Lord, that smile could have melted the snow off the peaks. "I haven't decided yet." But Elias had already decided. He was falling for a woman whose real name he didn't even know, and every instinct he had told him that loving her would destroy them both. He just didn't know how right he was. The ring fell from her coat pocket like a confession. Elias picked it up with fingers that knew the weight of secrets, turning the gold band toward the lamplight. Engraved in elegant script, C. Fletcher, 1882. C. Fletcher. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and the warmth from his blood. In that moment, everything made sense. The expensive clothes, the educated speech, those goddamn green eyes that had been haunting his dreams and his waking hours in equal measure. Catherine Fletcher. The daughter of Silas Fletcher, the man whose son Elias had killed 5 years ago in a dusty street in Deadwood. "You were going to tell me eventually, weren't you?" Catherine. She stood frozen in the doorway, having just returned from checking on the horses, snowflakes still melting in her dark hair. The color drained from her face as she saw the ring in his palm. "Elias, I don't." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Just don't lie to me anymore. I've had enough lies for one lifetime." She sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling as she reached for the ring. When their fingers touched, the jolt of electricity between them was undeniable, even in this moment of betrayal. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know who you were when I came here. I was running, and I was dying. And you saved me. From what? What were you running from?" The story came out in broken pieces, like fragments of shattered glass that cut deeper with each revelation. Cornelius Wade, the railroad baron, who'd bought her like a piece of property. The marriage contract that would merge 2 empires and crush every small farmer between Cheyenne and Denver. The desperate flight north toward Canada and freedom that had ended with a bullet in her shoulder from her own father's men. "He's arranged everything," she said, tears tracking silver paths down her cheeks. "Wade has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in our partnership. If I don't marry him, he'll destroy everything my father has built. Every ranch hand, every family that depends on our land. They'll all suffer for my selfishness." Elias should have felt vindicated. This was Fletcher's daughter, his enemy's blood, crying in his cabin about problems that weren't his to solve. But all he could see was a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, just like he'd been trapped by one terrible moment of violence that changed everything. "Your brother," he said quietly. "Tommy, I need you to know, it wasn't murder. It was a gunfight, fair and square. But he was drunk and young, and I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know you're not the monster my father painted you as. If you were, you would have left me to die in the snow." She stood slowly, moving to the window where moonlight painted her profile, in silver and shadow. Tommy was wild, reckless. Papa tried to control him, but... She shrugged, a gesture full of old pain. "Some people are just born to break hearts, aren't they?" The silence stretched between them like a rope under tension, ready to snap. "So what now?" Elias asked. "You know who I am. I know who you are. We both know this can't end anywhere good." Catherine turned from the window, and in her eyes was something fierce and desperate and beautiful. What if it could? What if we just left? Together? Running away doesn't change what we are, Catherine. Doesn't change what I did to your family. Maybe not. She moved closer. Close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair, see the pulse beating in her throat. But maybe it could give us a chance to become something different. Something better. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. When she stepped into his arms, he didn't step back. And when she lifted her face to his, her lips parted in invitation. Elias Blackwood finally admitted that some sins were worth committing. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like a question being asked. Then she made a small sound in her throat, half sigh, half surrender, and suddenly there was nothing tentative about it. His hands found the small of her back, pulling her against him as she melted into his embrace. She tasted like promises and possibilities, like everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. "This is madness," he whispered against her lips. "Then let's be mad together," she whispered back, and the firelight danced across her face as she smiled. Outside, the wind howled its warnings, but neither of them was listening anymore. Winter nights in the high country stretch like eternity, dark and cold, and full of the kind of silence that makes a man think too much about his mistakes. But that night, wrapped in Catherine Fletcher's arms, Elias discovered that some kinds of warmth can burn away even the deepest regrets. She came to him like a whisper made flesh, her silk nightgown catching the dying firelight as she crossed the room. Every step was liquid grace, every movement designed by God to drive a man past the edge of reason. "Are you sure about this?" His voice was rough with desire and doubt in equal measure. "I've never been sure of anything in my life," she said, settling onto the bed beside him. "But I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people decide my fate." Her fingers traced the scar on his chest, an old bullet wound from his lawman days, and everywhere she touched, his skin came alive. "Tell me about this one," she whispered. "Bank robber in Dodge City, 1879. His breath caught as her lips followed the path her fingers had taken. Thought he was faster than he was. "And this?" Her hand found another mark, lower, where a knife had once come too close to ending everything. "Saloon fight." "Can't even remember what started it." He caught her hand, brought it to his lips. "Catherine, you don't have to. I want to." She silenced his protests with a kiss that tasted like desperation and desire. "I want to know every story your body tells. I want to write new ones." She was beautiful in ways that made a man forget his own name. The curve of her throat in the lamplight, the way her dark hair spilled across his pillow like silk against cotton, the soft sounds she made when his mouth found the hollow of her collarbone. But it was more than beauty that undid him. It was the way she looked at him like he was something precious instead of something broken. When she arched beneath him, her fingers digging into his shoulders, he knew he was lost. When she whispered his name like a prayer, he knew he was found. And later, as they lay tangled in sheets and moonlight, her head on his chest and her breathing slow and even, Elias Blackwood understood that love wasn't something you could plan for or prepare against. It hit like lightning, sudden, devastating, and impossible to control. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. "That I'm a fool." "Why?" "Because I'm falling in love with a woman I can never have." She raised her head to look at him, her eyes serious in the lamplight. "What if you already have me? What if love is enough to rewrite the rules?" Before he could answer, horses nickered in the distance. Catherine went rigid in his arms, her face draining of color. "They found me," she whispered. Elias was already reaching for his gun belt. The peaceful moment shattered like glass against stone. How many? 20. Maybe more. She was pulling on her dress with quick, practiced movements. Papa doesn't take chances. Through the window, torches flickered between the trees like fallen stars. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather. Men who knew their business, closing in like wolves on wounded prey. The back window, Elias said, checking the loads in his Colt. There's a trail that leads to... No. Catherine's voice was steady now, resolved. I won't run anymore. I won't let you die for my cowardice. Catherine. A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by the cold air and the certainty of power. Blackwood, I know you're in there. Send out my daughter, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to regret touching her. Silas Fletcher had come calling, and he'd brought an army with him. Elias pulled back the curtain just enough to count muzzle flashes. 23 men, positioned in a rough circle around the cabin. Professional gunmen, every one of them, armed with the kind of confidence that came from always having the numbers on their side. Last chance, Blackwood. Send her out, or we burn you both. Catherine moved to the window beside him, her face pale but determined. Papa, she called out, I'm here, but I'm not your prisoner anymore. The silence that followed was more ominous than any threat. Then Silas Fletcher's voice, colder than the wind. You always were too willful for your own good, girl. But you'll learn. Wade's expecting a wedding, and by God, he's going to get one. That's when Elias knew they weren't walking away from this. Some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. And sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to risk losing everything. He kissed Catherine one more time, tasting tears and determination on her lips. Whatever happens, he said, I want you to know, loving you was worth it all. Outside, men were moving in the darkness, tightening the noose. Inside, two people who should have been enemies prepared to face the world together, knowing that some kinds of love are worth dying for. Dawn came reluctantly to the Wyoming mountains, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of blood and gold. 23 armed men formed a loose circle around the cabin, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their weapons trained on the only door. At the center of it all sat Silas Fletcher on a coal-black stallion, a man whose presence commanded attention and fear in equal measure. Even at 58, he carried himself like an emperor surveying his domain, which, in many ways, he was. Catherine. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You've had your fun playing house with this killer. Time to come home. The cabin door opened slowly. Elias stepped out first, his hands empty but ready, his pale eyes scanning the circle of gunmen with the calm assessment of someone who'd been in similar situations and lived to tell about it. Behind him, Catherine emerged, her chin raised in defiance despite the tremor in her hands. Hello, Papa, she said, and her voice carried across the clearing like a church bell. Silas's face softened for just a moment, a father seeing his daughter after months of worry and rage. Then the mask of control slipped back into place. You look thin, he said, and older. This is what running with killers gets you, girl. This is what freedom looks like, Catherine replied. Something you wouldn't understand. Freedom? Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think hiding in this godforsaken cabin with the man who murdered your brother is freedom? You think destroying everything our family has built is freedom? Tommy's death was an accident, and you know it. What I know? Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, is that Cornelius Wade has invested $200,000 in our partnership. Money he expects to see return through your marriage. Money that, if he doesn't get what he paid for, will bankrupt every family from here to Cheyenne. Is that the kind of freedom you want, Catherine? The freedom to watch innocent people suffer for your selfishness? The words hit their target. Catherine's face went pale, and Elias could see the doubt creeping in. The weight of responsibility that had driven her to run in the first place, now being used as chains to drag her back. "There has to be another way," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There is." The voice came from behind Silas, and a second rider moved into view. Cornelius Wade himself, 60 years old, soft around the middle, but with eyes like chips of flint. "Marry me willingly, and I'll be generous with the settlement. Your father keeps half his land. His men keep their jobs. Refuse." He shrugged. "Well, contracts have clauses for breach of promise." "Legal clauses." Elias had heard enough. "The lady's not going anywhere with either of you." 23 rifles swung toward him. 23 hammers clicked back. The sound was like bones breaking in the cold air. "You don't get a vote, Blackwood," Silas said. "You're lucky I'm letting you live long enough to say goodbye." "Maybe," Elias said calmly. "But I'm not going down easy. Question is, how many of your boys are you willing to lose for your pride?" For a moment, the clearing hung suspended in that dangerous balance that comes just before violence explodes. Then Catherine stepped between them, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stop." She looked at her father, then at Wade, then finally at Elias. "I have a proposition." "Catherine, no," Elias started. "Listen to me." Her voice cracked like a whip. "All of you, just listen." She moved to the center of the clearing, every eye fixed on her, and in that moment she looked like a queen addressing her subjects. Beautiful, terrible, and absolutely in control. "Mr. Wade," she said, "you've invested in a partnership that was supposed to give you access to Fletcher land and resources. What if I could guarantee you those things without a marriage that neither of us wants?" Wade's eyes narrowed with interest. "I'm listening." "A business partnership, 60-40 split. You get the majority stake you want, access to all our routes and resources, plus a cash settlement for the inconvenience of the broken engagement." "And where," Wade asked softly, "does a dead woman get that kind of money?" Catherine smiled, and it was her father's smile, cold and calculating. From her father's estate, of course. After all, if Catherine Fletcher were to die in a tragic accident, her inheritance would pass to her father, who could then use it to honor his daughter's final wishes. The silence was complete now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas stared at his daughter, with something approaching admiration. "You want to die." "I want to disappear," Catherine corrected. Catherine Fletcher dies in a blizzard, lost and alone, trying to reach Canada. Her body is never found, of course. Winter claims many travelers in these mountains. But her father, grief-stricken, honors the business arrangement she died trying to escape. Wade was nodding slowly. "Clever. Very clever. But what about him?" He pointed at Elias. "Witnesses complicate things." "What witness?" Catherine's voice was steady as stone. "Elias Blackwood died the same night, shot while resisting arrest. His cabin burned down in the struggle. Terrible tragedy, really. Just one of those things that happen on the frontier." Elias understood then. She was saving his life the only way she could, by erasing it completely, by making him disappear along with her, so they could disappear together. "Papa?" Catherine's voice was softer now, the little girl asking her father for one last favor. "Will you let me die with some dignity? Will you let me choose my own ghost?" Silas Fletcher looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she'd become. Strong, intelligent, ruthless when she needed to be. His daughter in every way that mattered. Finally, he nodded. "Boys," he called to his men, "you never saw any of this. Catherine Fletcher and Elias Blackwood died in this cabin 2 days ago. Everything else is just cleanup." 2 years later, in a valley outside Sacramento, where the California sun painted everything gold, a woman named Elena Martinez stood in the doorway of her modest ranch house, watching her husband Jose work with the horses in the corral. He moved with the same quiet confidence he'd always had, though his hair was shorter now, his beard trimmed neat, his hands soft from 2 years without gunfighter calluses. To anyone who asked, he was a Mexican immigrant who'd married a widow with a little land and a lot of dreams. Nobody questioned it. Nobody cared. In California, everyone was running from something. The letter had arrived that morning, addressed to Elena in handwriting she recognized. Inside, written in careful Spanish, "Mi querida Elena, the partnership prospers. Wade is satisfied with his investment, though he occasionally asks after his lost bride. I tell him grief makes old men foolish. The ranch hands speak well of their new conditions. It seems prosperity can make even robber barons generous. I think of you often. I hope the California sun treats you kindly. Your devoted friend, S." Elena folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bodice, close to her heart. Then she walked out to where Jose was gentling a young colt, her hand resting unconsciously on the slight curve of her belly, where their child grew. "Letter from home?" he asked without turning around. "From a friend," she said, leaning against the fence rail. "The business is doing well." Jose nodded, understanding all the words she didn't say. They'd left their old names in a burning cabin in Wyoming, along with their old guilts and their old sorrows. What they'd built here was smaller, simpler, but it was theirs. They'd learned what the Old West had always taught those brave enough to listen. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. Sometimes you have to die to truly live. And sometimes love is worth any price, even the price of becoming someone new. They were free. They were together. They were home. And that, in the end, was worth more than all the land and power and gold that the old world had to offer. Thank you for riding along on this journey through the American West, where love and redemption were always just one choice away from destruction. If this story moved you, show some love with a like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Until next time, may your own trails lead to somewhere worth the journey.